Okay. It seems almost every year there's more and more people that have some kind of a disability. And in the culture of biblical times, it was really only the most severe disabilities that would keep a person from contributing to the welfare of their family by working, such as if you were severely paralyzed or something like that. If it was much less than that, you would still be expected to contribute to the family's economy. For instance, if you were deaf, could not hear, you could still work out in the fields. Your lack of hearing wouldn't affect that. Or even if you were blind, you could still do some sort of routine task around the house, of course, to help out. And that's what we'll look at this morning, is deafness and blindness specifically. I think it's interesting when you compare the number of people nowadays who suffer from each. According to the World Health Organization, I was surprised to learn that almost twice as many people worldwide suffer from some sort of hearing loss than those who suffer from a sight disability. I really thought it would be the other way around, because you see so many people who wear corrective lenses. But if someone can't hear, it's not as easily known. As far as hearing loss is concerned, it's about 7% of the world's population have some sort of a disabling hearing loss, but the elderly suffer especially in this area. For those who are 65 and over, the number jumps from 7% to close to 33% suffer from a hearing disability in their older years. This morning we're going to go to the Bible and we're going to look at a man who was deaf, and we also read that he could not speak well. Now, whereas if you're blind, your other senses are typically heightened in order to compensate for your ability to see. Deafness is unique in that oftentimes that disability affects the way that you speak, because when you speak, you are relying on what you're hearing to know if you said something correctly. If you can't hear the words that you speak, then the sound and tone of your voice is going to be off, and it's going to be difficult for someone to understand. So that's the man that we're going to look at this morning. He suffered from deafness, which also affected his ability to speak. And since we're working through the middle of the Gospel of Mark, we just have to place this story in reference to where we've been. When we left off 2 weeks ago, we looked at how the Pharisees were trying to catch Jesus in a sin by saying that he and his disciples weren't ceremonially clean. The Pharisees, of course, were focused on man's tradition rather than God's law. And it's clear that they didn't see who Jesus really was. So Jesus then leaves the area. He goes to the pagan regions. And this is also a theme that runs through the Gospel of Mark, as Mark is inviting the reader to make these subtle comparisons between the Jewish leadership, who should know better in regards to Jesus but don't, and compare them to the pagan people who shouldn't know better but do. So Jesus then meets a woman whose daughter is sick, and Jesus has an interesting discussion with her before healing her daughter. And that encounter ends in Mark chapter 7, verse 30. So we'll pick up the story in Mark 7, verse 31, and just read 7 verses up to 37. Again, departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee. Then they brought to him one who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to put his hand on him. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. Immediately his ears were opened, and the impediment of his tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Then he commanded them that they should tell no one, but the more he commanded them, the more widely they proclaimed it. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. Now I'd like to read two very short verses out of the Old Testament that relates to this. And we go to Isaiah 35, verses 5 and 6. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the dumb sing. Those words are written some 700 or so years before Jesus comes on the scene. And Mark includes in his gospel the story of the deaf man healed in order to provide further proof that Jesus is who he says he is, the fulfillment of Isaiah 35, the promised Messiah. Something I want to call your attention to now just requires a bit of background knowledge. You may know that except for a few small portions of the Old Testament, most of it was written in the Hebrew language. By the time Jesus comes onto the scene, though, the Jews are under Roman control, and the Romans speak and write in Greek. So everyone is under the authority of Greek-speaking people, so the Jews had to learn the official language. Well, what do? They take their Old Testament from Hebrew and translate it into Greek. Okay, makes sense. That way it's in the language that everyone's using. I mention this because in that Greek Old Testament, the word that they use for a specific speech impediment that is only found in the Old Testament in Isaiah 35, verse 6 that I read to you. You fast forward to the Gospel of Mark, in the Greek also, guess what Greek word Mark uses to describe this man? That same Greek word that's only found one other time in Isaiah 35. So, his purpose is to make the connection that Jesus is the one that Isaiah was talking about back in Isaiah 35. He is the actual Messiah, and this is just one more reason why Jesus is the fulfillment. Now, we take for granted that we have the Bible, and you can get it online. You can buy them for $1 at the dollar store. We see the continuity in between the pages of Scripture, all the concepts that relate between different passages and stories. We see them separately and collectively. But those who were the players in those stories didn't have that benefit. So when Jesus heals this deaf man, this was probably the first healing that most of these people had ever witnessed. So they certainly wouldn't know, does Jesus heal people like this all the time? They may be wondering, does he always poke his fingers in people's ears, and is he always reaching in their mouths and touching their tongues? But from our perspective, we can see how Jesus tailors the method of healing for each individual case. And why is this important? Because Jesus wasn't using some kind of a magical incantation. He didn't open up a spell book and, okay, this is how to fix you if you're deaf and can't speak. It's nothing like that. This is proof that Jesus isn't your normal run-of-the-mill magician of the days. And he is much better than your run-of-the-mill magician. When we read the story, it's clear that there's a unique thing Jesus does, and it's the unorthodox way in which he heals this man. It serves several purposes. In the Bible, Jesus heals different people in different ways. Sometimes he heals just by speaking them healed. Other times, he touches them like he did with this man. Even among the times whenever Jesus heals people with his touch, I think we have to admit that most people wouldn't consider touching another person's ears or tongue. I think that's pretty obvious. Somewhere along the way, I remember reading that the average person feels comfortable with about 18 inches of personal space around them. So you don't go invading that space without permission. Now, if you're a dentist, okay, my dentist touches my tongue whenever he cleans my teeth, make sure there's no lumps or anything around there, and that's all good. But if my dentist next time spits on his glove and touches my tongue, I'm finding a new dentist, okay? There's things that you do and you don't do. But put yourself in the shoes of the deaf man who can't speak well. If I'm him, I can't speak, or I can't hear and can hardly speak. I want to be healed so bad. If it means you have to spit on your fingers and touch my tongue for that to happen, then go ahead and I'll just use some Listerine later. Okay, that's basically the way I look at it. And if it means the difference between me being able to hear or not, then poke around all you want. Just get it fixed. The point is, Jesus is doing things for a reason. And in our human situation, we never truly understand the sheer power of God. He is the one who spoke the whole universe into existence, from the smallest atom that we have identified up to the largest star that we've ever discovered, which, by the way, scientists say almost 4 quadrillion Earths can fit inside this largest star. Imagine the same power of God that created all that focused on 2 ears that can't hear, or focused on a tongue that can't speak. Jesus just says one word in the original language, Ephatha, which means be opened. And it must have been an amazing thing to witness. This is where we step back now and we compare the Jewish leadership to these pagans in the land of Sidon. First of all, look at the way that the pagans react to his healing. In verse 36, the people kept talking about it. The more Jesus told them don't, they kept talking about it even more. And I can't really blame them. This is a big deal. This guy couldn't hear, could barely speak, and now he can. Not long ago, in our story, Jesus was told by the Pharisees that he was a sinner because he didn't go through this elaborate ritual of washing his hands. And now, if you're in the shoes of Jesus, you see how these pagan people react with gratitude towards what you're doing. And you start scratching your heads and you're wondering, who are God's real people anyway? However, Jesus knew what God's will was. He was sold out to do that will, and I'm sure none of this surprised him one bit. Even though the man didn't suffer from a sight disability, there is a sight connection in here. In verse 34, it says, he looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said, Ephatha, which means be opened. Where it says be opened at the end of this passage, you have a Greek word dianoigo. Well, it has more than one meaning in the original language. The first and most common is be opened, which is what the text tells us. But guess what? Dianoigo means something else. It can also mean have understanding or open one's mind. So even when Jesus isn't directly talking about seeing, when he says this, he's saying, yes, be open, but he's also telling us, understand what I'm doing too. He's still talking about seeing and understanding even when it's not as obvious to us reading this in the 21st century. It's what God wants, us to see and understand who he is. Too often people operate under a false assumption of who God is. Rather than accepting that we are made in the image of God, people strive to make God in our own image. We have it backwards. It reminds me of Romans 12:2, where Paul talks about the renewing of the minds that the believers experience upon conversion, because we naturally don't think of things the way that Jesus would see them. Our minds need to be corrected and renewed when we receive salvation. And the last aspect of this passage I want to talk about this morning is, of all the things that we learn from this passage, we learn about Jesus' healing power, his compassion for all types of people, his willingness to be unorthodox in his ministry if need be. Something you may not notice is that it's sort of subtle. He's talking about the biblical concept of election. We know what any election is. We go and choose who we want to represent us at the polls. And the word election comes from an old French word meaning choose. Of course, no one's going to the polls in Matthew 7, but a choice is being made nonetheless. Jesus is choosing to heal this man out of his gracious spirit. And a lot of people today have this idea that everywhere Jesus walked, he healed people, and he never got anything else done because he was healing everyone. That's highly unlikely. I'm sure there were people with illnesses that he passed by for some reason or other and didn't heal. And that would not be sinful if he did that, because choosing not to dispense grace is not a sin. Jesus had a choice. He could have walked by this man and allowed him to continue in his deaf state, but he simply chose not to do that. You might say Jesus elected to help this man. Election is a biblical concept that is seen all throughout Scripture. The word doesn't appear until the New Testament, but we see images of it in the Old Testament. Jesus, of course, mentions that word in the New Testament. It's expanded on greatly by the Apostle Paul, and Peter even mentioned it a couple times in his letters. In short, it basically teaches that every person who is saved has been chosen or elected by God. Then the big discussion gets on, how does this work out? Does God elect us without our consent and drag us kicking and screaming into heaven? On the other hand, if we say that we have a say in the matter, why didn't Jesus ever ask his disciples if they wanted to come with him? He simply said, come. He chose them, they came. Well, we can't find an instance in the Bible where Jesus does ask anyone, do you want to come with me? In a similar way, Jesus heals the deaf and mute man without his consent. These are the questions that the church has struggled with for more or less 2,000 years, and they're very crucial. I understand that. But what we need to realize is that people in both camps on this, whether God simply chooses you, or, well, he chooses, but which way he does it, the fact is both camps have to admit that there is mystery surrounding their position. They cannot explain it 100% without appealing to the concept of mystery, no matter how hard they try. The important thing is that we can't allow this mystery and the things that we don't understand to stop us from seeking the Lord and trying our best to believe the truth, because this doctrine is a reflection of the character of God. It's a lesson in learning on how to get along with people we don't agree with. Just look at the deaf man in Mark 7. Once his hearing is restored, does he go to Jesus and he say, okay, Jesus, I'm thankful you did that. How did you do that? Why did you have to spit on your fingers to do that? And why did you have to touch my ears? He doesn't ask all these questions. He was just so happy that now he could hear because he couldn't before. All he wanted to do was tell everyone what happened. Do the details matter? Yes and no. I mean, yes, the details of our faith are important, because if you don't have details, which the Bible is full of, then anything goes. And we can say anything we want and it's true. That's not right. On the other hand, if we only concentrate on the details and blow them out of proportion and make them the ends, then that's not right either. What I think this passage is teaching us is that there are foundational concepts of the faith. The fact that this man was healed. Now, how he was healed and what that means is another issue. We can disagree on some of these secondary issues. It should be simple to tell what is foundational and what is secondary. If someone's teaching that Jesus Christ isn't the Son of God, that he's just a good teacher and he's not divine, the Bible clearly tells us that's not true. Jesus is the Son of God. He is divine, and there's reasons for it. And to teach otherwise will be a violation of that foundation of the faith. But if we go and we disagree on some nuances like end times interpretations, that kind of thing, where you could have virtually as many interpretations as there are people with an interpretation, it's not a black and white situation. As long as we agree that Jesus is coming back sometime, that is a foundational truth. The things surrounding and how we get there are a little murky. I just want to close by saying that we need to keep going back to our conversion experience and remembering how it felt when we first became a believer. Similar to Jesus healing this deaf man. He couldn't help his situation at all, just as we can't do anything in our unregenerate, sinful situation before God calls us as his children. This is part of understanding that Jesus is talking about when he says, be opened, understand what I'm doing. In other words, open your mind to these possibilities. And that's what happens when Jesus offers salvation. Our mind is open to a brand new world, like the renewing of our mind that I talked about in Romans 12:2. When we experience that kind of healing, opening, salvation, whatever you want to call it, why wouldn't you want to go out and run and tell as many people as you could? Verse 37 says, the people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. They couldn't quit talking about it because this is the natural reaction of people who have been touched by Christ. So that's what I want to leave you with this morning, is to just go back and remember what it was that brought you here in the first place, God calling you out of a unregenerate, sinful lifestyle and choosing you to be one of his children. Let's bow our heads and go to him in prayer.